She was 32 weeks pregnant when she heard another woman laughing in her bedroom. 10 years. 10 years she had stood beside the most feared man on the East Coast, managed his secrets, protected his name, built everything he pointed at and called his. And this is how it ended. Not with a gunshot, not with a rival family, with laughter behind a door she paid for. If you've ever loved someone who treated your loyalty like furniture, something useful until it wasn't, stay until the end of this story, like this video. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. This is Elena Sterling's story. And she didn't just survive it, she burned the whole empire down on her way out. The gate guard didn't call ahead. That was the first thing Elena noticed when the black SUV rolled through the iron entrance of the DeLuca estate at 10:30 on a Tuesday night. No radio crackle, no voice through the speaker system announcing her return. She'd been gone 4 days to her mother's house in Connecticut. 4 days of low blood pressure and swollen ankles and a baby pressing so hard against her ribcage that she couldn't sleep flat anymore. She had told Roman she needed rest. He had kissed her forehead and told her to take as long as she needed. The gate guard had waved her through without making a call. She noticed. She filed it away somewhere behind her sternum, in that place she'd trained herself to keep things quiet over the last decade. The place where small wrongnesses lived until they grew large enough to name. The driveway was lit by the landscape lighting she'd chosen herself. Warm amber along the stone path, soft white uplighting beneath the oak trees she'd insisted stay when the landscapers wanted to tear them out. The main house loomed at the end of it, 4 stories of pale limestone and black iron, 4,300 square feet of silence and security cameras, and expensive Italian furniture nobody ever actually sat in. She had decorated every room. She had chosen every painting, every rug, every slab of marble countertop. She knew the square footage of this estate the way she knew the dimensions of her own body. Not because she'd memorized it, but because she had built herself into it until the two were indistinguishable. Thomas, her driver, pulled the SUV to the motor court and cut the engine. "Mrs. DeLuca, it's fine." She was already reaching for the door handle. "I know the way." She climbed out slowly. 32 weeks meant nothing happened quickly anymore. Her center of gravity had migrated 6 inches forward, and every staircase in the world had become a negotiation. She pressed one hand to the small of her back, felt the familiar ache spread up through her spine, and moved toward the front entrance. The house was not quiet. That was the second thing. Not loud. Nothing as obvious as music or raised voices. But the house had a texture to its silence that she knew the way she knew her own heartbeat. And tonight, that texture was wrong. There was a quality of recent occupation to the air in the foyer, a warmth that didn't belong to an empty house. Someone had been in the kitchen. She could smell it, a faint trace of something cooked and cleared away. The overhead lights were off, but the accent lighting along the hallway floor was on. That amber glow she never used when she was alone because it made the house feel like a stage set waiting for actors. She set her bag on the entry console. The marble was cool under her palm. She stood there for a moment and breathed. She had learned long ago not to move fast toward things she didn't want to find. You got exactly one moment to prepare yourself before knowing became permanent, and that moment was worth taking. She was good at taking that moment. She'd had a lot of practice. She went upstairs. The hallway outside the master suite was carpeted in the ivory runner she'd sourced from a weaver in Belgium, and her footsteps made no sound. The double doors at the end were closed. She could see the thin line of light beneath them, warm and amber, the way Roman always kept the room when he was still awake. And then she heard it. Laughter, low and easy and unmistakably female. Not nervous laughter, not the polite kind, the comfortable kind. The kind that belonged to someone who felt no urgency about where she was or who might open the door. Elena's hand came to rest on the door handle without her having made a conscious decision to reach for it. Her palm was dry. That surprised her somehow. That her body wasn't panicking, wasn't flooding with the physical vocabulary of disaster. Her heart rate was elevated but steady. Her breath was controlled. The baby shifted inside her, a slow, heavy roll that pressed up into her diaphragm, and she exhaled against it. She opened the door. Roman was standing near the window, his back half turned, buttoning the cuffs of his dress shirt. The dark charcoal one, Thomas pink, She'd given it to him for his birthday 3 years ago. He was 44 years old and still built like a man who thought physical strength was a form of moral argument, broad through the shoulders, thick through the neck, the kind of body that wore expensive clothes like a threat. He had a drink on the windowsill. He'd been comfortable enough to pour himself a drink. Bianca Moretti was standing closer to the bed. Elena knew Bianca the way you know any person who has occupied the periphery of your life for years without ever quite entering it. Her name, her face, her role. 30 years old. Executive assistant to Marco Cardinale, Roman's consigliere, trusted enough to sit in on internal meetings, trusted enough to handle sensitive correspondence, trusted enough, apparently, for this. She was wearing Elena's robe, the pale silk one, champagne-colored, that hung on the back of the bathroom door. Bianca wore it with the easy authority of someone who'd worn it before, the belt loosely tied, one shoulder slightly exposed, dark hair down around her face. Neither of them spoke first. Roman turned and saw her, and his expression did something that was almost nothing, the smallest internal adjustment behind his eyes, a recalibration. He had been in dangerous rooms for so long that his face had become architecture rather than expression. He showed you exactly what he intended to show you. Right now he was showing her calm. Elena. His voice was level. Not warm, not ashamed. Level. Bianca straightened slightly but didn't move toward the door, didn't look away. That was a message too. She'd been briefed on who she was and what she was in this house, and she'd made her choices anyway. Elena looked at them both for a long moment. The baby pressed up into her ribcage again, that same slow, insistent roll, and she pressed her hand flat against her abdomen. It's not what you think, Roman said. She almost laughed, not because it was funny, because after 10 years of this man, after 10 years of watching him work a room and manage a negotiation and walk out of every corner anyone ever backed him into, the best he could produce in this moment was that. The oldest sentence in the history of this particular situation. It's not what you think. As if what she thought was the variable. As if her perception was the thing under discussion. Bianca. Elena's voice came out steady. She was a little surprised by that too. Get your clothes. Bianca looked at Roman. Roman gave nothing. Bianca gathered what she needed from the chair beside the bed. She had her things on the chair. She had made herself comfortable enough to put her things on the chair, and she walked through the door without meeting Elena's eyes. Elena stepped aside to let her pass, and then stood in the doorway and looked at her husband. He hadn't moved from the window. He held his drink at his side. He was watching her the way he watched things when he was deciding how much they were going to cost him. When did it start? Elena said. That's not a productive conversation right now. I didn't ask if it was productive. Elena, when did it start? He took a drink, looked out the window. The grounds outside were lit in that amber glow, the oak trees she'd saved casting long shadows across the stone paths she'd designed. He looked at all of it, and she could see him calculating what version of this conversation served him best. It doesn't matter when it started, he said finally. What matters is how we handle this. How we handle this? She repeated. You're 32 weeks pregnant. This is not the time for... Stop. She said it quietly. Don't manage me right now. I'm not a situation. He looked at her then, full on, for the first time since she'd walked through the door. Something moved behind his eyes that might have been something real, some flicker of the man she'd believed she knew before the years, and the power, and the machinery of what he'd built had calcified around everything that was once human in him. It was there for less than 2 seconds. Then it was gone. Affairs happen, he said, in this life. You know that. She held his gaze for another moment, memorized it. The drink in his hand, the shirt she'd given him, the room she'd decorated, the bed that was still warm with the evidence of what she'd walked in on. Then she turned and walked back down the hallway. She went to the kitchen. The kitchen was white marble and brushed steel, a room she had designed specifically for the image of a family that was going to live in this house someday, tall ceilings and an island large enough to roll pastry on, hooks for copper pots she'd bought at a market in Lyon. She turned on the overhead light and stood in the brightness of it, and the cold marble was hard under her feet. She took off her wedding ring. It was not a small ring. 4 carats, cushion cut, set in platinum, with a halo of smaller stones she had never particularly loved because Roman had chosen it without asking. And she had worn it for 10 years because that was the shape of how things worked between them. She had worn it through charity galas and estate meetings and late nights reviewing documents Roman shouldn't have let her see, and early mornings making sure the right people said the right things in the right rooms. She had worn it through 2 miscarriages and 1 surgery and 4 years of trying before the 32 weeks she was carrying now. She set it on the marble island. It made a small sound when it landed. Almost nothing. A click, a rattle, silence. She stood with both hands flat on the cold stone and breathed for 60 seconds. Then she went to the guest room, lay down on top of the covers, and stared at the ceiling until the light behind the curtains began to change color. She did not sleep. By 4 in the morning, she had made 3 decisions. They were not emotional decisions, which was important. She'd had years of watching Roman make decisions, and she understood that the ones made from emotion were the ones that cost you later. These 3 were logical, sequential, and would require immediate action. At 6:15, she called Gabriel Knox. Gabriel Knox was 61 years old and had practiced family law in New York for 37 years, the last 22 of which he had spent becoming the most feared divorce attorney on the Eastern Seaboard. He was not famous in the way actors are famous. He was famous in the way that certain diseases are famous, quietly, among people who understood what they were looking at. She had kept his number for 4 years, stored under a contact name that meant nothing, in a phone that was registered to a subsidiary of a subsidiary that Roman had no reason to think she knew existed. She had not been passive in this marriage. She had been patient. "Mrs. Sterling." Knox answered on the second ring, which meant he was already awake, which meant he was the kind of man who would be useful. He used her family name, not DeLuca, because she'd told him to when she'd first made contact 2 years ago in a lobby meeting that Roman's security team had no record of. "I'm ready," she said. A pause. "What changed?" He said, "Affairs happen." She looked at the ceiling. The light was coming up gray and slow through the curtains. "In this life." Another pause, shorter. "I need you in my office by 8. I'll be there." She dressed in the dark. She packed 1 bag, personal documents, the external hard drive she kept in a fire case in the back of her closet, a change of clothes, the medication her OB had prescribed for blood pressure. She moved through the guest room quietly, efficiently, without looking too long at any one thing. Roman was in his study when she passed through the entrance hall. She could see the light under the study door. He was awake. He had probably not slept either, but for different reasons. He was working angles, running calculations, deciding how to contain the situation. She knew how his mind worked. He would have already called Marco. He would have begun moving pieces. She walked past the study door without stopping. She had her own pieces to move. Gabriel Knox's offices occupied the 14th floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan that was the kind of deliberately unimpressive that cost enormous amounts of money to maintain. No name on the door, neutral carpeting, a reception desk staffed by a woman who looked through you the way people look through glass. Elena had been here twice before, once to introduce herself, once to review preliminary documents. This was the 3rd time, and it was the one that mattered. Knox was a compact man with close-cropped gray hair and the particular stillness of someone who had sat across from some of the most aggressive legal teams in the country and found the experience boring. He wore the same expression in all circumstances, a kind of considered neutrality that could read as disinterest until you noticed what he did with information. He did not sit across from her. He sat beside her at the conference table, which she'd noticed before, which she understood. He was not performing authority at her. He was working with her. "Walk me through where we are," he said. She opened her bag. Over the previous 2 years, Elena Sterling had photographed 4,312 documents from Roman DeLuca's private archive. She had done this during a period of 18 months when Roman had given her access to the archive for the purpose of organizing the charitable foundation's public records, a task he had handed to her carelessly, the way powerful men hand administrative work to wives, because they have stopped seeing wives as people with agency. She had organized the public records. She had also photographed everything else: financial records, Internal correspondence, property deeds registered through shell companies, wire transfers, corporate structures layered 5 entities deep, a personal calendar maintained in a physical ledger, handwritten, which meant it had never been digitized, and which Roman believed existed only in the archive room and in his own memory. The external hard drive contained scans of all of it. Knox looked at the drive. Then he looked at her. 2 years, he said. Yes. And he had no idea. He stopped looking at me as a person with ideas a long time before that, she said. It's useful, actually, being underestimated. Knox picked up the drive with the care of someone who understood exactly what he was holding. I'm going to bring in a forensic accounting team, he said. Hanford and Associates. They're the best, and they'll be fast. I want preliminary findings within 3 weeks. Do it. This is going to get hostile. I know. The legal team he deploys will be the most aggressive in the country. He'll try to move assets before we can establish the marital estate. He'll apply pressure on the court to seal proceedings. He has political relationships that... Gabriel. She stopped him. I know, Roman. I lived inside his operation for 10 years. I know what he'll do and in what order. She looked at the man steadily. He's going to underestimate me again. He does it reflexively. That's going to be expensive for him. Knox looked at her for a long moment with that neutral expression that wasn't quite as neutral as it appeared. All right, he said. Let's begin. She was back on the road by 10:30. She didn't return to the estate. Thomas had been quietly moved to a holding arrangement that allowed her use of the car and nothing else. She had planned that too, a clean handoff, no leverage Roman could apply by cutting off her transportation. She drove herself north in a rental car she'd booked through the same subsidiary registration, moving against the morning commuter traffic, the seat adjusted all the way back to accommodate what she was carrying. She called her obstetrician from the road. You sound different, Dr. Mendez said after Elena had explained the change in living arrangements. I'm fine, Elena said. I need to know what I need to avoid in terms of stress response in the 3rd trimester. A pause. Elena, are you actually fine, or are you managing yourself? Both, she said honestly. Can you help me do it safely? Another pause. Come in Thursday. We'll check everything, and I'll tell you what the parameters are. Thank you. She drove for 3 more hours. The town she'd chosen was in the mountains of Western Virginia. Small enough to offer anonymity, but not so isolated that it lacked medical facilities. She had researched it the way she'd researched everything, thoroughly, quietly, over time. She had rented the house under her family name, Sterling, paid 6 months in advance from an account Roman's team would need a forensic accountant of their own to locate. 3 bedrooms, a wide porch looking out at a ridge of birch trees, a kitchen with southern light. She had chosen it because it felt like a place where something could grow. She pulled into the driveway at 1:30 in the afternoon. She sat in the car for a moment with the engine off. This was the part where, if she were in a lesser version of herself, she might have cried. The baby shifted again, and she pressed her palm to where he moved and felt the pressure of him against her hand, real and immediate and completely indifferent to the complexity of what surrounded him. He didn't know about the empire she'd just walked out of. He didn't know about the ring on the marble island, or the woman in the silk robe, or the 10 years that had led to a man saying affairs happen like it was weather. He just moved. He just existed. Okay, she said out loud, to him, to the birch trees, to no one. Okay. She got out of the car and went inside. The following weeks had the quality of triage. She was not at rest. She was never at rest. Not really. Rest for Elena was the deliberate management of energy, the allocation of finite resources against a list of priorities that she kept updated in a notebook she'd carried for 15 years. Rest meant the body slowed down while the mind kept moving. She slept when the baby allowed it, woke before light, worked through the first hours of the day when her head was clearest, attended medical appointments via a doctor she'd found locally who understood that her situation required discretion, and spent the evenings on the porch watching the light leave the ridgeline. Roman called twice the first week. She didn't answer. She had no legal obligation to, and no intention to. On the 7th day, a courier arrived from his legal team. She accepted the envelope, signed nothing, and forwarded everything to Gabriel Knox within the hour. Knox called that evening. "He's moving faster than I expected," Knox said. "The asset transfer activity started within 48 hours of your departure. They're attempting to reclassify 3 properties as held by existing corporate entities predating the marriage." "The properties on the Jersey Shore," she said, "and the Tribeca building. You know about those." "I photographed the original purchase documents," she said. "The corporate entities were formed 9 years into our marriage. The dates are in the files." A pause. "Elena?" "Yes." "You're the most prepared client I have ever had." She didn't take that as flattery. She took it as a data point. Hanford and Associates came back with their preliminary report 18 days later. Elena sat in Knox's office and watched him read through the executive summary with the expression of a man who had seen a lot of things and was currently seeing something that exceeded his expectations. $38 million, he said. "That's the preliminary figure for assets transferred or concealed through the shell structure. Could go higher when we get deeper into the offshore component." "He was moving money to her," Elena said. "Bianca Moretti." Knox set down the report. 14 wire transfers over the course of 22 months. Property in Miami registered to an LLC she controls. A vehicle. Cash payments totaling. He was funding her life. Substantially. He looked up. "This changes the character of what we're filing. This isn't infidelity. This is financial misconduct inside the marital estate. That gives us grounds beyond what we'd normally—" "I know what it gives us," Elena said. She knew. She had known for some time that the affair would be less significant legally than the money, that Roman's greatest vulnerability was not what he did to her heart, but what he did to the financial architecture of their marriage. He had taken assets that belonged to both of them, and he had used them to build a separate life for another woman. He had made their shared estate into infrastructure for his deception. That was not an affair. That was something she could take to court. She was 7 months pregnant when Roman's legal team filed their first formal motion. They moved to seal all proceedings, citing the sensitive nature of the DeLuca family's business interests. The language was careful and dense and almost persuasive if you didn't know what it was actually protecting. Knox opposed it with the precision of a man who had spent 37 years making exactly these arguments. He cited precedent. He cited public interest. He cited the specific financial conduct that had been documented and that was now in the record. The motion to seal was denied. She found out via a text from Knox, 3 words, "Motion denied. Proceed." And she was sitting on the porch watching snow move down from the ridgeline in thin, shifting curtains, and she sat with the phone in her hand and watched the snow, and felt something in her chest that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite satisfaction, but lived somewhere between the two. Roman sent a message through an intermediary 2 days later. Not a legal document. A message, personal and handwritten, delivered by a man she recognized as one of Roman's trusted lieutenants, a man named Paolo, who had been in the organization for 20 years and who looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. She read the message in the kitchen. It was direct, not apologetic. Roman had never been apologetic. Apology implied a framework of obligation he didn't inhabit. The message said he wanted to discuss terms, that there was no reason for this to become what it was becoming, that he was prepared to be generous, that she should remember who she was dealing with. She folded the paper once and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it. That last line. She should remember who she was dealing with. She had spent 10 years remembering who she was dealing with. She had spent 10 years watching him work, watching him negotiate, watching him apply pressure and manage consequences and turn situations to his advantage. She had watched him because she loved him, and then because she lived with him, and then, for the last 2 years, because she was building a case. She knew exactly who she was dealing with. The question he had not considered, apparently, was whether he knew who he was dealing with. She picked up the phone and called Knox. "Tell them no," she said. She was 8 months pregnant when she went into labor 3 weeks early. It happened on a Thursday night, quickly and without particular ceremony, her body making its own schedule, indifferent to the legal calendar. She drove herself to the hospital 20 minutes away, which she realized later was the kind of thing that could have gone badly but didn't, and she was in a delivery room for 4 hours before the baby arrived. He came into the world at 2:17 in the morning. She had planned to name him Luca. She had planned that for months, quietly, in the private part of herself where plans lived before they became real. But she had not planned the last name until she was holding him. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, dark hair, eyes clenched shut against the light. And the nurse asked for the full name for the birth certificate. Sterling, she said. Luca Sterling. Not DeLuca. Not the name that moved through the underworld like weather. Not the name on the gate of the estate she'd walked out of. Not the name that appeared on the private ledgers and the shell company documents and the 14 wire transfers to a woman in a champagne silk robe. Her name. His name now. She lay in the hospital bed in the small hours of the morning with Luca Sterling on her chest, and she listened to him breathe, and she thought about the road back to what she had left. And she knew, with the kind of clarity that comes only when everything non-essential has been stripped away, that there was no road back. There was only what came next. And what came next was going to require everything she had. Roman received word that his son had been born before Elena sent any formal notification. She had not been surprised by this. His network of information was extensive, and she had not tried to hide where she was. But the name on the birth certificate had apparently reached him through back channels within hours, and Knox called her the following morning with a particular tone in his voice. "He's furious," Knox said, "about the name. About the name. His legal team has already contacted mine about the birth certificate. They're floating the argument that—" "Let them float it," she said. She was sitting up in the hospital bed with Luca asleep on her chest, her hand curved around the back of his head, the weight of him the most real thing she had encountered in months. "Let them float every argument they have. We have the documents, we have the forensic accounting, and we have a recorded phone call I haven't given you yet." A pause. "What recorded phone call?" "The one from 14 months ago," she said. "Roman and Bianca." On a line he thought was clean, he told her the following. She quoted from memory because she had played it enough times to have it exact. "Affairs happen. You'll get over it." Silence on the other end. "You'll get over it," Knox repeated. He was talking to her, reassuring her. She was apparently worried about me finding out. She looked down at Luca's face, the slow working of his jaw in sleep. "The irony is rich. How do you have that recording?" "I hired someone 2 years ago to monitor certain lines I had reason to believe were being used for communications I wasn't meant to know about. Everything was done within the legal parameters of the state where Roman was located when the calls were made. She had been thorough about that. She had been thorough about everything. The recording is authenticated, the metadata is intact, the chain of custody is clean." Knox was quiet for a moment. "I need that recording," he said. "It'll be in your inbox by noon." She looked down at the baby sleeping on her chest. Luca Sterling breathed in and breathed out, small and warm and entirely unconcerned with the machinery moving around him. She had approximately 90 days before this went to trial. She thought about what those 90 days would require. She thought about Roman's legal team, which was the most expensive and experienced in the country and would work without rest to protect what he'd spent decades building. She thought about the political relationships he'd cultivate to apply pressure on the court. She thought about the network of loyal lieutenants who would do whatever he needed done in the gray spaces where loyalty operated. She thought about all of it, and she was not afraid. She was focused. There was a difference, and she had learned it. The baby shifted on her chest. She pressed her palm to his back, that warm weight, and he settled again. Outside the hospital window, the morning was coming up blue and clear, cold light cutting across the mountains. The birch trees on the ridge she could see from this angle catching the first of the sun. She had walked away from everything Roman DeLuca had built. She had 4,312 photographs, a forensic accounting report, a recorded phone call, and a newborn son who shared her name. She was not done. She was, in fact, just beginning. And Roman, in his estate surrounded by his security and his lieutenants and his legal team and everything he had spent his life accumulating, had no idea what was coming. Not because Elena was ruthless, because he had never in 10 years looked at her closely enough to know what she was capable of. That oversight was going to cost him everything. Luca Sterling was 11 days old when Roman DeLuca's legal team filed for emergency custody intervention. Elena was sitting at the kitchen table in the mountain house feeding the baby in the 4 o'clock stillness when her phone lit up with Knox's name. She answered it one-handed, the way she did everything now, her whole body reorganized around the weight and rhythm of the child in her arm. "They filed this morning," Knox said, without preamble. Emergency motion. They're arguing that the birth certificate constitutes a unilateral attempt to alienate the child from his father's legal identity, and that your departure from the marital home without notice represents an instability that warrants court intervention on the child's behalf. She looked down at Luca. He was eating with the focused intensity of someone who had no interest in the conversation happening above his head. Instability, she said. That's the word they used. I left a marriage in which my husband was having a funded long-term affair. I relocated to a residence I own, where I gave birth safely and have been providing continuous care. That's their definition of instability. It's a filing strategy, Knox said. They're not expecting it to hold. They're trying to push you into a defensive position before we get to the financial discovery phase. If you're reacting to custody maneuvers, you're not advancing the asset case. She understood that. She sat with it for a moment, felt the calculation of it, the familiar architecture of Roman's tactical thinking. He did not do one thing at a time. He layered. He created noise in one direction while moving quietly in another. She had watched him do it at dinner tables and in back rooms, and across negotiating tables for a decade. What do we need to respond, she said. Affidavits from your OB confirming prenatal care continuity and the safety of your current living situation. Documentation of the residence, lease, utilities, medical access within reasonable distance. A declaration from you. Draft the declaration. I'll review it today. Elena. Knox's voice shifted slightly. The emergency motion won't succeed, but it's going to require court appearances. You're 11 days postpartum. I know what I am, she said. She hung up and looked at her son and felt the particular exhaustion of a body that had been through something enormous and had not been given adequate time to process it before the next thing arrived. Her incision was still healing. She was sleeping in 90-minute intervals. Her hands shook slightly in the mornings before she ate, a blood sugar thing the doctor had told her was temporary and normal, and which she treated by keeping crackers on every flat surface in the house. She was tired in a way that had no bottom. She was also not stopping. She shifted Luca to her shoulder and picked up a pen. The affidavit process took 4 days. Knox sent his paralegal to the Mountain House, a young woman named Sarah, who moved with quiet efficiency and did not ask personal questions, and together they assembled the documentation package that would respond to Roman's emergency filing. Elena signed everything with Luca asleep in a carrier against her chest, his weight steady and warm, his breath a small rhythm against her collarbone. The motion was denied 8 days later. Roman's attorneys appealed the denial within 24 hours. Knox called her when the appeal came in. He's not going to stop, Knox said. No, she agreed. He never does. I want you to understand what the next several months look like. They're going to file motions. We're going to respond. They're going to appeal. We're going to respond again. They're trying to exhaust our resources and your energy. He knows I don't have his resources. He's counting on it. She looked out the window at the birch trees. The snow was gone. Something thin and green was happening along the ridge, the first suggestion of color after the long white months. I have the photographs, she said. I have the forensic accounting. I have the recording. What he has is money and time. Which of those actually wins in a courtroom, Gabriel? A pause. In my experience, preparation. Then we're fine. But she was not entirely fine, and she knew it. The nights were the hardest part. Not because of Luca. He was demanding, but navigable. A small body with a clear vocabulary of need that she was learning with the focused attention she gave to everything that mattered. The nights were hard because Roman's campaign against her was running on a schedule that didn't care about feeding times or healing incisions or the particular loneliness of 3 in the morning in a house in the mountains where she knew almost no one. She did not indulge the loneliness. She noted it, filed it, moved on. But it was there. She had been inside Roman's world for so long that the boundary between his life and hers had dissolved somewhere in the first years. She had given up the art world. She had been building a career as a curator when they met, a good one, a promising one. And she had folded herself into the infrastructure of what he was building because he had needed someone with her particular intelligence, and because she had been 28 and in love and had not yet understood the difference between being valued and being used. She had run charitable foundations, managed public relations, maintained the social architecture that kept his legitimate operations credible. She had done it with the same precision and care she brought to everything. She had done it and called it a partnership. She understood now what it had been. The realization didn't make her angry, exactly. It made her clear. She had given Roman DeLuca 10 years of her specific and considerable intelligence. She was 38 years old, and she was going to get it back. She started making calls. The first was to David Margolis, who ran the Margolis Foundation's curatorial program and who had tried to hire her 3 separate times over the years, each time being told by Elena that she was not available for outside professional commitments. He remembered her. He was surprised to hear from her. He was immediately interested. "Are you coming back?" he asked. "I'm coming back," she said. "Not full-time yet, not for a few more months, but I want to consult. I want to stay in the conversation. Elena, I have a project." His voice shifted into the register of professional excitement, a quality she recognized and had missed without knowing she missed it. "The Foundation is mounting a survey show of overlooked American painters, women primarily, mid-century, mostly out of the mainstream conversation. I need someone with the eye you have, someone who can—" "Send me what you have," she said. "I'll look at it this week." She worked while Luca slept. She worked with him on her chest in the carrier. She worked at the kitchen table with the monitor on and a mug of tea going cold beside her laptop. It was not the way she had imagined re-entry into a professional life, but it was not the way she'd imagined most of the things currently constituting her life. And she was finding that the gap between imagined and actual was something you either adapted to or you didn't. She adapted. She was reviewing a digital archive of a painter named Ruth Kavanaugh, born 1931, died 1989, largely ignored by the mainstream market, extraordinary, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was from Marco Cardinale. She listened to it twice. Marco Cardinale was 53 years old and had been Roman's consigliere for 17 of those years. He was the person Roman trusted above all others, which meant he was also the person who had been most intimately aware of everything Roman was doing, including the arrangement with Bianca, including the financial transfers, including the years of choices that had led to this. He had never, in Elena's presence, behaved as if she was a person whose perspective warranted consideration. His voicemail was careful. He wanted to speak with her, privately, outside the legal process. He believed there were aspects of the situation that could still be resolved in ways that would benefit everyone involved. He used the word benefit the way people use it when they mean be good for me specifically. She called Knox before she called Marco back. "Do not meet with him," Knox said immediately. "Anything said outside the legal process can be characterized however they choose. If they want to communicate, they communicate through counsel. That's what I expected you to say. And I want to know what he thinks he's offering." Knox's exhale was controlled and annoyed. "Elena, not a meeting, a phone call, documented on my end. I want to know what he believes he can negotiate with, because what he believes tells us something about what they're afraid of." A pause. 2 minutes. I want Sarah on a separate line documenting the conversation in real time. Agreed. She called Marco back. He answered on the first ring, which told her he had been holding the phone. "Elena." His voice was warm in the practiced way of someone who had spent decades performing warmth as a management tool. "Thank you for returning my call." "What do you want, Marco?" A brief pause. He had expected a warmer opening, apparently. "I want to help resolve this. For everyone." "Resolve it how?" "Roman is prepared to be, He chose the word carefully. Comprehensive. In terms of a settlement. We're talking about a figure that would ensure you and the child are fully provided for permanently, complete financial security, in exchange for what? A return to private mediation, sealed proceedings, an agreement that the financial documentation you've gathered stays within the settlement process and doesn't become part of any public record. She let that sit for a moment. He wanted to buy the documents. He wanted to buy the forensic accounting and the photographs and the recording, wrap them in a settlement agreement, seal them, and make them disappear. He wanted to pay her to bury the evidence of what Roman had done. No, she said. Elena, I don't think you understand the scale of what we're... I understand it exactly. The scale is the problem, Marco. The scale of what he hid, what he transferred, what he built for her using assets that belong to our marriage, the scale is why we're going to trial. She kept her voice level. Pass that to Roman and tell his legal team to stop filing emergency motions about a newborn baby, because every one of those filings is going into the record and none of them are going to look good when the judge reviews the full picture of this case. She ended the call. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she opened her laptop and went back to Ruth Kavanaugh. The trial date was set for late September, which gave her approximately 5 months. She used them. She used them the way Roman had trained her, without intending to use time as a resource, finite and non-renewable, to be allocated with precision against a hierarchy of priorities. She healed. She rebuilt her professional life in the margins around Luca's schedule. The Margolis Foundation project, expanding from a consulting arrangement into something that was beginning to feel like real work again, the kind that required her whole brain and made her aware of the parts of herself she had let go dormant. She prepared for trial with Knox's team, reviewing documents, preparing testimony, working through every angle of what Roman's attorneys would try to do with her. She also found out what Roman was doing inside the organization. She had sources. Not many, but carefully maintained. People who had been loyal to her in small, quiet ways over the years, who had noticed what she did and how she did it, and who had their own complicated feelings about how it had been handled. She did not ask them for information directly. She asked them for the kinds of general updates that stayed inside the category of social communication and which, taken together, gave her a picture. The picture was not good for Roman. The indictment threat was real. The FBI had been investigating the DeLuca organization for 2 years, which she had known. Roman had mentioned it obliquely several times, in the way of a man who believed himself untouchable. But the investigation had apparently accelerated in the months since her departure. The financial exposure created by the civil proceedings had opened lines of inquiry that the government had been trying to open for years. When your forensic accountants identify $38 million in concealed assets in a divorce proceeding, those findings do not stay invisible to other interested parties. Roman was under pressure from directions he had not anticipated, and inside the organization, the pressure was producing friction. She heard from one of her sources, a woman named Diane, who ran the foundation's public events calendar and who had an ear for everything, that there had been arguments. Between Roman and Marco specifically. She didn't know the content. She knew the fact, and the fact was useful because Roman and Marco did not argue. They had not, in her experience, ever argued. They were the same organism in 2 bodies, sharing the same instincts and the same framework of priorities. If they were arguing, the framework was cracking. She filed that away. She was 4 weeks from trial when Roman appeared. He did not announce it. He simply appeared at the end of her driveway on a Saturday morning in late August, in a black car she didn't recognize, alone or apparently alone. She couldn't see whether there was a driver. She was on the porch with Luca, who was 5 months old now and interested in everything, propped up against her bent knees and examining his own hands with an expression of profound philosophical inquiry. She saw the car, and she went very still. He got out. He looked like Roman. That was the thing about him. The years and the weight of everything had not physically diminished him. He was still large and deliberate in his movements, still wore his clothing like armor. But there was something around his eyes, a compression of something that she identified, after a moment, as exhaustion. Not the kind she recognized from late nights or difficult decisions. Something deeper, something that had been happening over time. He walked up the driveway without being invited. She did not stand up. She sat on the porch with her son on her lap and she watched him come. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. They looked at each other. Luca turned his head toward the new person and regarded him with the focused, solemn attention of a baby encountering something unfamiliar. Roman looked at his son. She watched his face in that moment. She had promised herself she would not read it, would not allow herself to be moved by whatever appeared there, because she knew Roman's face was not a reliable document. It showed what he permitted it to show, and she had spent too long trusting it. But she watched anyway, because she was human, and what she saw was something she had not seen on him in years. He just looked at him. No calculation in it, no performance, just looking. "He has your hairline," Roman said. "Yes." Can I? He stopped. No, she said. Not like this. Not outside the legal process. His jaw tightened. Elena, you filed an emergency custody motion 11 days after I gave birth. You sent Marco to offer me money to disappear. You have been trying to bury what you did in this marriage since the day I walked out. Her voice was steady. She had practiced this steadiness not in front of a mirror, but in the actual long work of maintaining it under pressure. You don't get informal. You don't get to show up at my house and use my son's face to... I'm not using anything. His voice had an edge in it now. He's my son. He has my name. The edge sharpened. I noticed. Good. He stood at the bottom of the steps, and she sat on the porch, and the mountain light came down through the birch trees, and Luca put his fist in his mouth and made a noise of satisfaction. I want to talk, Roman said. Not through lawyers, not through Marco. I want to talk to you. About what? About whether there's a version of this that doesn't burn everything to the ground. She looked at him for a long moment, at the exhaustion around his eyes and the controlled tension in his jaw and the way he held himself still when he wanted to move, which she recognized because she had watched him manage himself in difficult rooms for 10 years. Roman, she said, I gave you 10 years. I built everything you pointed at and called yours. And when you found something more convenient than me, you funded her with money from our marriage, and you looked me in the eyes and said, affairs happen. She paused. There is no version where that doesn't get said in a courtroom. That recording is going into evidence. The photographs are going into evidence. The $38 million in concealed assets is going into evidence. She looked at him steadily. The version where it doesn't burn is the version where you had been a different man. That version doesn't exist anymore. He stood there. Something moved across his face. She couldn't name it, and she didn't try. I'll see you in court, she said. He stood at the bottom of her porch steps for another 15 seconds. She counted. She watched his hands, which were still, and his face, which was working to be still. And she held Luca against her chest, and she did not look away. Then Roman turned and walked back down the driveway and got in the car and left. She sat on the porch for a long time after the car was gone. Luca had fallen asleep against her shoulder, that sudden absolute infant sleep, warm and heavy. She held him and breathed and listened to the birch trees move in whatever air was moving through the ridge. She was shaking slightly. Not from fear, she recognized the difference now, but from the particular physiological cost of holding yourself completely together when everything in your body is responding to the presence of someone who matters. He had mattered. For a long time, he had mattered more than anything. That was the part she didn't say out loud, the part she held privately in the place behind her sternum where things lived until they were processed. The grief of it was real. It was allowed to be real. It didn't change anything. Her phone rang. Knox. My surveillance team flagged a vehicle at your address, he said. He came himself. A silence. What did he want? He wanted to know if there was a version of this that doesn't burn everything down. And you said, I said, see you in court. Knox breathed. Good. Elena, I need you to hear something. We received discovery materials from Roman's legal team this afternoon. They had a motion in the works that I expected. They're attempting to challenge the admissibility of the recording on the grounds that the monitoring was done without Roman's awareness, and they're citing, it was done in a state where single-party consent applies, she said. I was party to the monitoring arrangement. The call was made from a line registered to an address within that state. I had my attorney review the legality before I authorized anything. She paused. I told you, I've been preparing for a long time. Knox was quiet for a moment. 4 weeks, he said. 4 weeks, she agreed. She looked out at the ridgeline. The light was moving the way it did in late afternoon in these mountains, golden and almost horizontal, coming through the trees at an angle that made everything look significant. She had 4 weeks before the courtroom. 4 weeks before Gabriel Knox presented $38 million in concealed assets and 4,000 photographs and a recording of her husband's voice saying affairs happened to a judge and a jury, and anyone else who needed to understand exactly what kind of man had stood at the bottom of her porch steps, asking for a version of this that didn't hurt. She looked at the road where his car had been. Something had shifted in the last hour, something she hadn't anticipated. She had seen his face when he looked at Luca, that unguarded 2 seconds of just looking, and she had felt the weight of what was lost and what had been squandered, and she had felt it fully, which was the only way to feel things if you wanted to move through them. She had moved through it. What remained on the other side was the same thing that had been there all along, the truth her son deserved to grow up knowing. And in 3 days, she would find out that Roman's own consigliere had been talking to the FBI for 6 months, that Marco Cardinale, the man Roman trusted above all others, the man who had sat across from her and offered money to make her disappear, had been feeding information to federal investigators in exchange for his own immunity arrangement, and that the trial Elena was preparing for was about to become the least of Roman DeLuca's problems. She found out on a Tuesday. Knox called at 7 in the morning, which was early even for him, and she knew from the quality of his silence in the first second before he spoke that something had changed shape overnight. Marco Cardinale has been cooperating with the FBI for 6 months, Knox said. We got confirmation this morning through a contact in the federal building. He entered into a proffer agreement in February, full cooperation in exchange for immunity on 3 counts of racketeering. Elena was standing at the kitchen counter with a half-made cup of coffee in her hand. She set it down. February, she said. February. She ran the calendar backward. February was 3 months after she'd left. 3 months after she'd placed her ring on the marble island and walked out into the dark. Marco had watched Roman's marriage collapse, watched the legal machinery begin to move, and within 90 days had made his own calculation and walked into a federal building. What is he giving them? She said. We don't have the full scope yet, but based on what my contact indicated, financial records, organizational structure, operational decision-making going back approximately 8 years. The kind of testimony that comes from someone who was in the room. Knox paused. Elena, this changes the trial landscape significantly. How? The federal investigation is active and accelerating. Roman's legal team knows about the cooperation. They filed a motion this morning in federal court attempting to suppress Marco's testimony, which means they've known for some time and have been managing it. The civil trial proceeds on our schedule, but what happens in that courtroom is now being watched by people who are building a separate and much larger case. She picked up her coffee, drank it without tasting it. Does Roman know it's Marco? She said. He knows someone is talking. Whether he knows it's specifically Marco, Knox stopped. The motion his team filed was specific enough that yes, he knows. She thought about Roman and Marco, 17 years, the kind of trust that gets built in the dark, in rooms where nothing said can be unsaid, where loyalty is not a sentiment but a survival mechanism. Marco had known where everybody was buried, literally and otherwise. He had been Roman's second mind, his institutional memory, the person who carried the weight of what the organization actually was beneath the charitable foundations and the legitimate businesses and the careful public architecture that Elena had spent years maintaining. And Marco had walked into a federal building in February and started talking. Roman is going to believe I had something to do with this, she said. Knox's pause was a half-second too long. That concern has been raised by his legal team, yes. They filed an ancillary motion suggesting that I had nothing to do with it. I know that. The FBI doesn't care about my divorce case. They've been building this for years. Marco made his own decision. I know, Knox said again, but Roman is not going to see it that way. And his legal team is going to use that narrative to paint you as someone who has been running a coordinated campaign to dismantle not just the marriage, but the entire organization. That changes how the jury perceives your evidence. It potentially makes you look less like a wronged spouse and more like a strategist. Yes. She set the coffee cup down again. Luca was making sounds from the bedroom, the preliminary sounds of waking up, that small working through toward consciousness that she had learned to read in the months since he arrived. She had maybe 4 minutes before he needed her. I'm a strategist, she said. I was married to one for 10 years and I learned from the best. That is not a crime. No, Knox said. But it needs to be handled carefully in how we present you. We need the jury to understand the difference between a woman who prepared herself and a woman who is running an operation. Those might be the same thing. Not in a courtroom, they're not. She was quiet for a moment. Gabriel, does the Marco situation help us or hurt us? A breath. Honestly, both. It helps us because Roman is now fighting a two-front war. His resources and attention are divided. His legal team is scrambling. His political relationships are going to start distancing themselves the moment the federal cooperation becomes public, which it will. He paused. It hurts us because Roman is cornered, and cornered men with his resources are not predictable. She understood that. She had seen Roman cornered twice in 10 years, once by a rival family that had moved on his territory, once by a federal investigation. He collapsed for reasons that were never fully explained. In both cases, cornered Roman was the most dangerous version of Roman. He became very still and very focused, and he made decisions that other people wouldn't make, because other people calculated losses differently than he did. She had 4 minutes, maybe 3 now. Tell me what I need to do differently, she said. Nothing, Knox said. Stay your course. The evidence is what it is, and it's devastating on its own terms. We don't need the federal case. We don't need Marco. We have what we have, and it's enough. Okay. Elena. Yes. Watch your surroundings. I don't believe Roman would... He stopped, chose the next words with care. I don't think he would take an action that would guarantee the destruction of everything he has left. But he's not in a rational position right now, and I want you to be aware. I've been aware since February, she said. Longer. She hung up and went to get her son. He was lying on his back in the crib, examining the mobile she'd hung above him, 5 months old, and already treating the world like a puzzle he was going to solve if he looked at it long enough. She picked him up and held him and pressed her face against his hair, and breathed. She allowed herself 30 seconds of that. Then she put him in the carrier, made a proper cup of coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table with her laptop. The federal cooperation news broke publicly 4 days later. It moved through the media the way these things move. A brief, careful report in one publication, followed within hours by expansion in others as reporters who had been watching the De Luca organization for years recognized the significance of what they were seeing. Marco Cardinale, consigliere to Roman De Luca, was cooperating with federal authorities. The De Luca organization, long suspected of operating behind an elaborate network of legitimate businesses, was the subject of an active federal investigation. Elena did not read the coverage. She had Sarah send her a summary, and she read that instead, clinically, for relevant facts. Roman's legitimate business partners began calling that same afternoon. Not her. She had no relationship with them directly, but Knox picked up the signals through the financial monitoring they'd established. Investment partners, real estate associates, the kind of men who had spent years telling themselves that the money was clean and the association was peripheral and nothing was going to happen. They were moving, not yet running, but moving. She knew Roman could feel it. She knew because she'd watched him feel it before, the slight seismic shift of people beginning to recalculate their proximity to him. She had watched him manage it, contain it, reassert enough authority and calm that people came back. He was very good at that. The question was whether he was good enough at it when the seismic shift was this large. The answer came 12 days before trial. It came in the form of a phone call she should not have taken and would not have taken if the number had not been the one she was looking at, which was not Roman's number and not Marco's number, but a number she associated with someone she had not heard from in 4 years and had not expected to hear from at all. She answered it. Elena. Claudia De Luca was Roman's younger sister, 41 years old, and she had been outside the organization's operations for most of her adult life by her own determined choice. She lived in Chicago, ran an architecture firm, had a husband and 2 daughters, and a life that she had built at deliberate distance from what her brother did. Elena had liked her, had genuinely liked her, which was rarer in that world than people understood. Claudia, she kept her voice neutral, I'm surprised you're calling. I'm surprised I'm calling too. A pause. Claudia's voice was strained in a way that wasn't its natural register. I need to tell you something. I don't know if I should, and I've been sitting with this for 3 weeks, and I think you need to know. Elena's hand tightened on the phone. Tell me, she said. Roman found out about the recording. He's known about it as evidence, his legal team told him, but he found out about the specifics, the content. Claudia stopped. He knows what's on it, Elena. He knows you have him saying those words. That's not news. His team knows we're entering it as evidence. You don't understand. Claudia's voice dropped lower. He's not. This isn't about the trial for him anymore. You have to understand how he's seeing this. He's not angry about the divorce or the money. He's angry about what those words mean, said out loud, in a courtroom. Another pause, and in it, Elena could hear the weight of something Claudia was deciding whether to say. He said, Elena, he said he's going to... I heard him on the phone with someone. He said he was going to make sure you understood the cost of this before you walked into that courtroom. The kitchen was very quiet. Luca was asleep in the other room. She could hear the small white noise machine she ran for him, a soft static that filled the house. Who was he talking to? Elena said. I don't know. Someone in the organization. I only heard his side and only part of it. Claudia's voice had a quality of someone standing at the edge of something they hadn't intended to approach. I don't know exactly what he means. I know Roman and I know that voice, and I'm telling you, I'm scared. Elena sat very still. Claudia. She kept her voice even. Thank you for calling. I need you to tell me if you hear anything else, anything specific, and I need you to not tell Roman you called me. He'd never forgive me. I know, do it anyway. A long pause. Is the baby okay? He's perfect. Good. Claudia's voice broke slightly on the word and repaired itself quickly. Good. She hung up. Elena sat in the kitchen with the phone on the table in front of her and breathed through the calculation happening in her chest. This was the specific part, where the logic of what she was doing met the reality of who Roman was. And the reality was that he was not a man who lost. He had built an entire life, an entire world, on the fundamental premise that he did not lose. That premise had been challenged by federal investigations and rival families and market forces and everything else the years had produced, and each time he had bent around it, absorbed it, reconstituted himself around the core truth that he was Roman DeLuca and he did not lose. She was about to walk into a courtroom and make him lose. She knew what that cost. She had always known. She had planned for financial retaliation, legal retaliation, the full application of his resources and influence against her case. She had planned for custody battles and asset warfare, and the slow grinding pressure of a man who could afford to fight longer than she could. She had not planned for this version, the voice Claudia had described. The cost of this before you walk into that courtroom. She called Knox. I need a security assessment, she said. Tonight. A silence. Tell me. She told him. Knox was quiet for the duration of it. Then, I'm sending a team to your location within the hour. Do not leave the house until they arrive. I have a 5-month-old. I'm not going anywhere. Elena. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, something that existed below the professional register. This is the moment where you need to tell me if you want to consider no. You haven't heard what I was going to say. You were going to ask me if I want to consider a different approach to trial. A settlement. Something that removes the recording from the equation or reduces its role. Something that gives Roman a version of this he can accept without feeling publicly destroyed. She looked at the table, at the surface of the wood. No. Elena, he threatened me. Her voice was flat. He threatened me, and he did it because he thinks I'll do what I've always done, which is calculate the cost of resistance and decide it's too high. He thinks I'm going to look at what he's capable of and fold. She pressed her hand flat against the table. Tell me something, Gabriel. In 37 years of practice, has any case you've been part of ever actually punished a man like this for what he did? If the woman folded? A long pause. No, he said. Then send the team and we go to trial. The security team arrived at 9:15. 3 people, 2 men and a woman, professional and quiet. They walked the property, assessed the access points, made recommendations about additional lighting and a secondary lock on the back door, and a protocol for Elena's movements in the 2 weeks before trial. She listened to all of it and agreed to all of it. That night she sat on the porch after Luca was asleep with a mug of tea she didn't drink, and she thought about the woman she had been when she'd walked into this house 7 months ago. 32 weeks pregnant and carrying an external hard drive and a commitment to something she hadn't yet tested against actual pressure. She thought about what the pressure had felt like over the months. The custody motions, the settlement offers, Marco's phone call, Roman appearing at the end of her driveway, Claudia's voice, strained and frightened, saying, "I'm scared." She thought about whether she was scared. She was. She was not going to pretend otherwise, not even in the privacy of her own assessment. She was a woman alone in a mountain house with an infant and a security team that had been there for 4 hours and a trial in 12 days, and a man on the other end of all of this who had 30 years of knowing how to apply force in directions people didn't anticipate. She was scared. She was also the woman who had spent 2 years photographing documents in an archive room while her husband sat in the next room believing she was manageable. She was the woman who had maintained a relationship with a divorce attorney for 4 years before she ever used him. She was the woman who had researched recording laws in 7 different states and had made sure that every step she took was within parameters that would hold up under the most aggressive legal scrutiny. She was scared, and she was prepared, and in her experience, those two things were not incompatible. Her phone buzzed, a text from Knox. "Security footage from the estate. You need to see this." He sent a file. She opened it. It was 37 seconds of surveillance footage from a camera she recognized, the one positioned above the entrance to the archive room in the estate, the room where she had spent 18 months photographing documents. The timestamp was 11 months ago, which placed it 8 months after she had completed her work in that room and removed the hard drive. Roman was in the footage, standing in the archive room, looking at the shelves. He spent 37 seconds in there and then walked out. He had gone back. He had checked. She watched the footage twice. Then she sat with what it meant. He had known, or suspected, for almost a year that she had been in that room for reasons beyond what he had given her access for. He had gone back to look at it, and he had said nothing. He had continued the legal proceedings, continued the custody motions, continued the settlement offers, without acknowledging that he knew what she might have taken from that room, because he didn't know the specifics. He suspected, but he didn't know. And Roman DeLuca, with all his capabilities, had spent 11 months trying to find out how much she had and what exactly she intended to do with it. Now he knew. His legal team had told him, the recording, the photographs, the forensic accounting. Now he knew the full scope of it, and he was 12 days from a courtroom. Knox texted again. His team filed a new motion tonight. They're challenging the provenance of the photographic evidence, claiming the archive access was granted for a limited purpose and the photographs represent unauthorized removal of proprietary materials. She responded immediately. The archive contained marital financial records. I had legal access as a spouse. What's their argument? Knox. That the materials were business records, not marital assets. They're going to argue you photographed proprietary organizational documents and that their use in the civil trial prejudices an ongoing federal investigation. She stared at the screen. This was it. This was the move she had not seen coming, the one Roman had been working toward while she'd been watching for the others. He wasn't trying to suppress the financial evidence on its merits. He was going to claim she had taken documents she wasn't entitled to take, and that using them exposed her to liability and potentially contaminated the federal case. He was going to try to make her the criminal. She called Knox. He answered immediately. They're filing tomorrow morning, he said, before she could speak. Judge Harlan's courtroom. Emergency motion to exclude all photographic evidence and for sanctions against counsel. Can they do this? They can file it. Whether it succeeds is a different question, but Elena, if Harlan grants even a temporary exclusion pending hearing, we go to trial without the photographs. We still have the forensic accounting and the recording, but the photographs are the spine of the financial narrative. They show the documents in their original context. They establish the timeline of concealment. I know what they do, she said. I took them. If Harlan excludes them, we need to rebuild the financial narrative around the accounting alone. It's still strong, but it's not the same. No. She stood up from the porch chair. She walked to the railing and looked out at the dark, and the birch trees were invisible in it, just presences she knew were there. The night was cold for August, something moving down from the peaks, and she hadn't brought a jacket, and she stood in the cold and felt it, and let herself feel it. He had been in that archive room 11 months ago, knowing she'd been in there. He had waited. He had let the whole case build, let discovery proceed, let the forensic accounting come in, let Knox build the narrative. And then, 12 days before trial, when she couldn't rebuild the entire evidentiary structure, he had filed the one motion that could pull the spine out of everything she had spent 2 years constructing. He had let her believe she was further ahead than she was. She understood it because she had watched him do it before. He absorbed pressure. He absorbed it, and let the other person believe they were winning until the moment he chose to apply everything he'd been holding back. She had watched him do this to rivals, to business partners, to people who thought they understood the game and didn't. She had not believed he would do it to her. Or rather, she had believed she had planned for it. She had not planned for this. She went back inside and sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and the phone and the security team's quiet presence in the house around her. She pulled up the archive access documentation she had kept, the original email from Roman granting her access, the scope of work as described, every communication that had accompanied the access arrangement. She read through all of it, and then she found it. In the third paragraph of the original authorization email, written by Marco Cardinale on Roman's behalf, 11 months before she'd begun photographing, access is granted to the full archive for purposes of Foundation Records organization and any other administrative needs arising therefrom. Any other administrative needs arising therefrom. She read it 3 times. She picked up the phone and called Knox. Gabriel. Her voice was steady, steadier than she felt. Pull the original archive access authorization. The email from Marco Cardinale dated October of the year before last. She heard him moving, the rustle of a search. Then a pause. Any other administrative needs arising therefrom, he read. Yes. Another pause. Longer this time. Elena. His voice had shifted entirely. This is the argument. This is how we defeat the motion. The access was broad. It wasn't limited to Foundation records. It explicitly included other administrative needs, and the determination of what constituted an administrative need was not specified or restricted. Marco drafted that language, she said, probably because he was doing her administrative work constantly, and he wrote his own access authorizations broad enough to cover whatever Roman might need. He wasn't thinking about me. He was thinking about himself. Silence on Knox's end. Marco Cardinale, Knox said slowly, who is currently cooperating with the FBI, who drafted the authorization that defeats Roman's motion to exclude your evidence. Yes, Elena said. She looked at the kitchen table, at the surface of the wood, at the room she had chosen for its southern light and its space for growing things. File the response first thing tomorrow, she said. I want it in before they file the motion if we can manage it. I want Harlan to see our argument before he sees theirs. I can have it drafted in 3 hours. Do it! She sat at the table after she hung up. The house was quiet around her. The security team had settled into a rotation she could barely hear. Luca slept in the other room with his white noise machine covering the world in soft static. She thought about Marco, about a man who had spent 17 years at Roman's side and had apparently, at some point in those 17 years, decided that the arrangement was not what he had signed up for, or not worth what it was costing him. A man who had drafted an authorization email with language loose enough to drive a case through. A man who was, in a federal building somewhere, telling investigators everything he knew. She did not know why Marco had flipped. She would likely never know the full reason. The reasons people step out of the lives they've built are usually too layered and too private to reduce to a single explanation. But the email existed, and in 12 days she was going to walk into a courtroom with 4,312 photographs and a forensic accounting report and a recording and the legal authorization to use all of it, and Roman DeLuca was going to have to sit across the aisle and watch everything he'd done become part of the permanent public record. She thought about his face at the bottom of the porch steps. She thought about Claudia's voice, strained and frightened. She thought about a courtroom and what it would cost both of them to sit in it. She breathed in and breathed out, and then she opened her laptop and began preparing her testimony. Outside, the mountain dark was absolute and cold, and the birch trees stood in it doing what trees do, which is hold their ground and wait for the light to come back. And she worked through the night toward the version of the morning that was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. She was going to be ready for it. Knox filed the response at 5:47 in the morning. Elena knew the exact time because she had been awake when he sent the confirmation, sitting at the kitchen table with her third cup of coffee and the testimony outline she had been working through since midnight, and her phone had lit up with the timestamp and 2 words: filed. Wait. She waited. Judge Harlan's clerk contacted Knox's office at 8:20 to confirm receipt of both filings, Roman's motion to exclude and Elena's preemptive response. Harlan had requested both parties appear for an emergency hearing at 2 in the afternoon. Not a full argument, a preliminary conference to determine whether the motion warranted extended briefing or could be resolved summarily. Knox called her at 8:30. "You need to be in New York by 1, he said. "I know. How are you?" "I'm functional." "Elena, how are you?" She looked at the window. Morning was coming up clear and cold over the ridge, the birch trees catching early light, Luca's sounds beginning to filter through from the bedroom. She had not slept. Her eyes felt like she'd rinsed them in sand, and her hands had the slight tremor that came from too much caffeine and not enough food and the specific sustained tension of the last 12 hours. "I'm scared," she said, "and I'm ready. Those are still not incompatible." "No," Knox said, "they're not. I'll see you at 1. She drove to New York with the security team's car following at a distance Knox had arranged. Luca stayed at the mountain house with a woman named Greta, who had been providing childcare for 3 months, and who Elena trusted with the same calibrated precision. She trusted everything, carefully, with verification, never completely. She kissed him before she left, his warm, solid weight in her arms, and he grabbed at her collar with his fist, and she breathed him in and put him down. The drive was 2 hours and 40 minutes. She spent the first hour reviewing her testimony outline. She spent the second reviewing the archive authorization email until the language was as fixed in her memory as anything she had ever memorized. She spent the last 40 minutes looking at the road. Harlan's courtroom was on the 9th floor of the federal building, and it had the quality that all rooms with real institutional power have, a kind of compressed air, a weight that accumulated from every decision that had been made inside it. She had been in rooms like this before, beside Roman, watching him operate. She had never been in one as the person whose future it was deciding. Roman was already there when she arrived with Knox. He was at the defense table with 3 attorneys she recognized from filings, and one she didn't. A younger man who moved with the focused efficiency of someone brought in specifically for this motion. Roman was in a dark suit, charcoal, not the Thomas pink shirt, a different armor for a different room. He did not look at her when she entered. He was reviewing documents with the concentrated stillness of someone managing themselves very carefully. She sat down. Knox set his materials on the table with the unhurried precision of a man who had done this 10,000 times. Judge Harlan came in at 2:03. He was 67 years old with a face that had processed decades of people trying to manage his courtroom and had become, through that processing, entirely immune to performance. He sat down, looked at both tables, and opened the file. "I've read both filings," he said. "Counsel for petitioner, you're claiming the photographic evidence was obtained through unauthorized access to proprietary materials. Counsel for respondent, you're arguing the access authorization explicitly covered the materials photographed. That's the narrow question. Let's deal with it." He looked at Roman's lead attorney, a man named Sellers. "Mr. Sellers?" Sellers stood. He was the kind of attorney who understood that Harlan did not want theater and delivered accordingly, precise, without warmth, the argument stripped to its essential structure. The archive materials were business records of an ongoing organization, not personal financial documents within the scope of marital discovery. The access granted to Mrs. DeLuca, he used the name deliberately, Elena noted, was for foundation purposes, and the photographs taken exceeded that scope by a significant margin, encompassing operational documents whose use in civil proceedings created prejudice to an active federal investigation. Harlan listened without expression. Mr. Knox. Knox stood. He was 2 inches shorter than Sellers, and 30 years more dangerous in a courtroom, and he knew exactly how much time he had. He placed the authorization email on the record. He read the relevant language aloud. Any other administrative needs arising therefrom. He cited 3 cases establishing that spousal access to marital financial records did not require explicit enumeration of specific document types when access had been broadly granted in writing. He noted that the materials photographed included financial records directly relevant to the concealment of marital assets, not organizational structure, not operational procedure, financial records, and that the characterization of those records as proprietary business documents rather than marital financial assets was a legal argument, not a factual one, and was directly contradicted by the forensic accounting already in the record. He sat down. Harlan looked at the authorization email for 30 seconds. Then he looked up. Motion denied, he said. The language of the authorization is unambiguous. All photographic evidence is admissible. We proceed to trial as scheduled. He closed the file. Anything else? Sellers was already on his feet. Your Honor, we'd like to request, Mr. Sellers, I've ruled. Do you have something new to add to the record, or are you asking me to reconsider what I said 40 seconds ago? A pause. No, Your Honor. Then we're done for today. Elena did not allow herself to react until she was in the corridor outside the courtroom with Knox beside her and the heavy door closed behind them. Then she put her hand flat against the corridor wall and breathed once, fully, from the bottom of her lungs. 9 days, Knox said quietly. 9 days, she said. She drove back to the mountain house. The 9 days that followed had the quality of the hours before something large and irreversible, a particular texture of time that is not exactly slow and not exactly fast, but has a density to it, each hour weighted with everything it contains. She finished preparing her testimony. She reviewed the forensic accountant's report until she could recite figures from memory. She went through the recording one final time with Knox's team, listening to Roman's voice say, affairs happen in the clean digital silence of a conference room, and she let herself hear it fully, not as evidence, not as a legal instrument, but as the thing it actually was, which was a man revealing himself. And then she set it aside. She slept, in intervals. She ate, deliberately. She held Luca every morning on the porch until the light came fully over the ridge, his weight the most grounding thing she had access to, and she talked to him in the low, quiet voice she used when no one else was there, telling him things she would tell him again when he was old enough to understand them. On the morning of the first day of trial, she woke at 4 and lay in the dark for 20 minutes. She thought about Elena Sterling at 28, newly in love with the most powerful man she'd ever met, standing in a gallery talking about a painting she believed in. She thought about what that woman had wanted. She thought about the distance between that and this, the decade of small compressions and accumulated silences and choices made inside the logic of someone else's world until the logic had felt like her own. She got up. She put on the suit she had chosen 3 weeks ago, dark blue, structured, not performing softness and not performing aggression, performing the specific thing she was, which was a woman who knew exactly what she was doing in that room. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for exactly as long as it took to confirm that she looked like herself. And then she went to say goodbye to Luca and drove to New York. The courtroom for the civil trial was different from Harlan's federal room, larger, with more light, the kind of institutional space that holds families and money and wreckage of every variety. It was full by 9. She had not expected that. Knox had warned her that there would be press interest given Roman's public profile and the scope of the financial findings, but the actual fact of the gallery packed with observers had a weight she felt in her chest when she walked in. Roman was already seated at his table. This time he looked at her. She met it. She did not look away, did not soften it, did not offer him anything in it. She held it for the 3 seconds it took to cross to her table and sit down, and then she turned to Knox and they began. The first 3 days were the financial narrative. Knox's forensic accountant, a woman named Dr. Patricia Voss, who had testified in 47 cases and had the particular authority of someone who makes complex things clear without making them simple, walked the court through $38 million of concealed assets with the methodical precision of a surgeon. Shell corporations, wire transfers, property registrations, offshore accounts, the structure of concealment built over 9 years of the marriage, the accumulation of a separate financial world built inside the visible one. Elena watched the jury. She had been told not to watch the jury. She watched them anyway, in the peripheral way of someone who has spent years in rooms where reading the room was survival. She watched their faces when the numbers came in. She watched their faces when the wire transfers to Bianca Moretti's accounts were itemized, 14 transfers, the Miami property, the vehicle, the cash. She watched what happened to the air in the room as the picture assembled itself in real time. Roman's attorneys cross-examined Dr. Voss for a full day. They were good. They were the best money could assemble. They challenged methodology, challenged interpretation, challenged the characterization of individual transactions. Voss answered everything with the same calm precision she'd brought to the direct examination. Not defensive, not aggressive, just accurate. At the end of the day, Elena walked out of the courthouse into the late afternoon and stood on the steps and breathed New York air and felt the specific exhaustion of a day spent being completely controlled in a situation that required it. Knox appeared beside her. "How do you feel?" he said. "Like I've been holding my breath for 8 hours." "You have." He looked out at the street. Voss was excellent. She was. "Tomorrow is the security footage." She nodded. The surveillance footage from the estate, Bianca entering the property on 34 separate occasions during the periods when Roman had told his household staff and his calendar that he was attending business meetings. Knox was going to walk through each instance, 34 dates, 34 documented lies. "And the recording," she said, "day after tomorrow." She went back to her hotel. Knox had arranged a hotel for the duration of the trial. The mountain house was too far for daily commutes. And she called Greta to check on Luca, and she ate something she didn't taste, and she lay on the hotel bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the city outside the window doing what cities do at night, which is keep moving regardless. The security footage day was harder than the financial testimony. Not legally. The footage was clean and its implications were unambiguous. It was harder because it was the human content of what had happened laid out in a different way. 34 dates appeared on the courtroom screen one after another, and for each one, Knox established Roman's stated whereabouts from calendar entries and then showed Bianca's vehicle arriving at the estate. The repetition of it, the sheer volume of documented occurrence, had an effect on the room that the numbers hadn't quite produced. Elena kept her eyes on the evidence screen. She did not look at Roman. She heard him, heard the quality of stillness from his table. That particular density of a man managing himself under conditions that were costing him significantly. She did not turn toward it. She had one job in this room, and it was not to watch Roman suffer. It was to be present, controlled, and credible. The recording came in on the third day. Knox laid the foundation with methodical care. The technical expert who authenticated the recording, the chain of custody documentation, the legal memorandum establishing the jurisdiction, and the single-party consent compliance. Roman's attorneys objected twice. Both objections were overruled. Then Knox played it. Roman's voice filled the courtroom. "Affairs happen. You'll get over it." 22 words. Less than 6 seconds of audio. The room's air changed. Elena had heard the recording many times. She had chosen to hear it as evidence, as an instrument, as something with a legal function. Sitting in the courtroom hearing it played through speakers while 12 jurors heard it for the first time, she heard it differently. She heard a man talking to a woman who was worried about the wife finding out, reassuring her, dismissing the wife's potential pain in 6 words, as though the pain had a ceiling that was someone else's problem to manage. She pressed her hand flat against her thigh under the table. She breathed. She did not cry. She was not going to cry in this room. She had decided that 3 weeks ago, and the decision held because she was the person who made decisions that held. Roman's attorneys moved to the recording's emotional impact in their cross, arguing that the context of the statement was a private communication not intended for public interpretation, that the words out of context suggested a callousness that didn't reflect. Knox objected on grounds of speculation and was sustained. The following day, Elena took the stand. She had testified in depositions. She had given statements. She had answered questions from opposing counsel for hours across multiple sessions over the preceding months. She had not done this. The witness stand in a live courtroom, 12 jurors, Roman 10 feet away, and the physical experience of it was different from everything she'd prepared for in the way that the actual thing is always different from the preparation. Knox led her through the direct examination with the structure they'd rehearsed, the 10 years of the marriage, her role in building and maintaining the legitimate operations, the foundation work, the social architecture, the access to the archive, and what she had found there. He was steady, and she was steady, and they moved through it at the rhythm they had built over months of preparation. Then he asked her why. Mrs. Sterling? He used her name, her real name, and she felt the jury register it. You've described a substantial amount of preparation over a period of years. Can you tell the court what motivated that preparation? She had the answer ready. She had prepared it, refined it, stripped it down to what was true rather than what was effective. Because in her experience, those were usually the same thing. I knew what I was part of, she said. I had known for a long time. I knew what Roman's world was, what it required, what it cost. I made choices that I understood were choices. She looked at Knox and kept her voice level. When I found out about the financial deception, not the affair, the money, the $38 million he moved out of our marriage, I understood that the man I had made those choices beside had been running a different calculation the entire time. He had been taking the life we built together and using it as infrastructure for something else. She paused, and I thought about my son, about what he was going to know someday, about who his parents were and what happened between them. And I decided that the truth needed to exist somewhere that wasn't controlled by the person with the most resources to manage it. Knox nodded. And the statement on the recording, affairs happen. When you heard those words, what did you understand them to mean? That I wasn't a person in that conversation, she said. I was a logistical problem. The jury. She let herself look at the jury. She didn't look for sympathy. She looked for comprehension. She looked to see whether the picture that had been assembled in this room over 3 days had become coherent, whether the numbers and the footage and the voice and the woman on the stand had added up to something a person could see whole. She thought it had. Then Roman's lead attorney stood up. The cross-examination was aggressive in the way of someone executing a strategy that had been prepared for months and that they were not going to deviate from, regardless of how the room felt. Sellers went after her methodically. The preparation, the relationship with Knox that predated the marriage's end, the photographs, the monitoring arrangement. He wanted the jury to see strategy instead of survival. He wanted them to see calculation instead of a woman protecting herself and her son. She answered everything. She was calm and she was direct, and she did not flinch from the characterization he was trying to build because the characterization was partly accurate and she had nothing to hide about it. You maintained a relationship with a divorce attorney for 4 years before filing, Sellers said. Yes. You began photographing archive materials approximately 2 years before leaving the marital home. Yes. You arranged for the monitoring of phone lines you believed were being used by your husband. Yes. So it would be accurate to say that for a significant period of time, you were operating inside this marriage with the specific intention of building a legal case against your husband. She looked at him. It would be accurate to say that I was living inside a marriage that had already become something other than what I had agreed to, she said, and that I chose to understand my situation clearly rather than pretend I didn't. That's not what I asked. It's what I answered. Sellers moved on. He came at the recording from a different angle. He wanted to argue that the monitoring was a violation of Roman's reasonable expectation of privacy regardless of the consent statute, that the ethical character of the person who would monitor her husband's calls was relevant to how the court should weigh her testimony. He was not going to win the legal argument, Harlan had already ruled, but he was making it for the jury. You listened to your husband's private conversations, Sellers said. I monitored a phone line I had reason to believe was being used to conduct communications relevant to my marriage, she said, and I was right. Did you tell your husband you were doing this? No. Why not? Because I was concerned about what I might find, she said. and because the person I would have told was the person I was concerned about. She felt the jury. Sellers shifted. He leaned slightly forward in the way that meant he was approaching something he considered the sharpest point of his argument. Mrs. Sterling, you've testified about your role in building your husband's legitimate operations, the charitable foundations, the public relations, the social infrastructure. He picked up a document. You managed those operations for 10 years. You understood their structure. You understood how they functioned and how they were presented publicly. He set the document down. Isn't it true that the man your husband is, the public profile, the charitable reputation, the legitimate business standing, isn't it true that you helped build that? That you spent a decade making Roman DeLuca look like exactly the kind of man whose behavior in this marriage would be most damaging if exposed? The room was quiet. Elena understood what he was doing. He was trying to make her complicit in the construction of the target she was destroying. He was trying to make her an architect of her own grievance. She breathed. Yes, she said. I did build that. I built it the way you build anything you believe in at the time. She kept her voice level. And when I discovered that the person I built it with was systematically using it to hide $38 million from our marriage while funding a separate life for another woman, I documented what I found, and I came here. She looked at Sellers directly. I'm not sure what the argument is. That I should have built less? That doing my job well makes what he did acceptable? Sellers opened his mouth. I'm not done, she said. The room held its breath. One day my son will ask who his father was, she said. Not just who Roman DeLuca was publicly. The profiles and the foundations and the reputation I spent 10 years helping maintain. Who he was. And I wanted the answer to exist somewhere that wasn't just Roman's version of the story. She kept her eyes on Sellers. That's why I'm here. That's why I prepared. That's why every document in this case is in this case. My son deserved that, and I decided he was going to have it. The courtroom. She felt the courtroom. Sellers had nothing to follow that wasn't going to make it worse. He said, "No further questions," and sat down. Knox rested the following morning. Roman's attorneys called 2 witnesses. A financial consultant who challenged the forensic accounting's methodology and a former foundation employee who testified about Elena's management style in terms designed to suggest coldness and calculation rather than competence. Knox cross-examined both with the efficiency of someone removing obstacles rather than engaging with them. The financial consultant's methodology challenges were countered by 3 of the accounting's own documentation protocols. The foundation employee's characterization of Elena's management style became, under cross, a description of someone who was exceptionally organized and consistently professional, which was not the picture Sellers wanted. Roman did not testify. She had not expected him to. He was too experienced, too aware of what the cross-examination would produce. But the decision not to testify had its own cost in the room, a silence where the jury's questions went unanswered, and she watched their faces when Sellers announced that the defense rested and saw what was there. Closing arguments were on a Friday. Knox stood before the jury and did not perform. He summarized. He laid the evidence in sequence, the numbers and the footage, and the recording and the testimony, and he connected the pieces with the minimum language necessary to make the picture complete, and then he sat down. Sellers argued for 40 minutes. He was skilled and his argument was structured, and it had essentially no purchase on what the evidence had established. The jury deliberated for 7 hours and 40 minutes across 2 days. Elena sat in the waiting area outside Knox's office during deliberations and did not eat much and drank too much coffee, and had 1 call with Greta about Luca and 1 call with David Margolis about the Kavanaugh exhibition, and worked on the exhibition notes with the focused attention of someone who needed her hands on something that had nothing to do with verdicts. The call came in at 3:17 in the afternoon on the second day. Knox appeared at the office door. His face was the same neutral expression it was always, but there was something in his eyes. "They're back," he said. She stood up. The verdict was read at 4:02. Primary custody awarded to Elena Sterling. Comprehensive financial judgment. Official finding of financial fraud and concealment within the marital estate. Compensatory damages that, combined with the forensic accounting judgment, represented the largest civil award in a marital proceedings case in the state's recent history. She heard it. She sat completely still, and she heard every word of it, and she let it be real. Roman was across the room. She could see him in her peripheral vision. He was very still. His attorneys were leaning toward him, speaking in low, rapid voices, and he sat in the middle of it without moving. She did not look at him directly. She looked at Knox. Knox looked back at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Something that existed below the professional register, something that was, she thought, relief. The relief of a man who had put significant effort into something and found that it held. It held, she said quietly. It held, he said. Outside the courtroom, in the corridor, with the late afternoon light coming through the building's high windows, she stopped walking. She stood in the light. She was 38 years old, and she had just won the largest civil judgment of her kind in this state, and she was shaking, not the caffeinated tremor of the last weeks. Something different, the physical acknowledgement of something completed, of a sustained effort released. She pressed her back against the corridor wall and breathed. Knox stood beside her without speaking. He understood the need for the moment. She thought about Luca, about the mountain house and the birch trees and the porch where she'd sat with him in the early mornings telling him things he'd understand later. She thought about Ruth Kavanaugh, born 1931, died 1989, extraordinarily gifted and largely ignored, whose work was going into a show that Elena was going to make people see. She thought about the woman who had stood in a gallery at 28 talking about a painting she believed in. She was not that woman anymore. She was not lesser than that woman. She was not greater. She was what that woman had become after 10 years and a courtroom and 4,312 photographs and a recorded voice saying affairs happen and a son who carried her name. The shaking was slowing. She pushed off the wall. "I need to call Greta," she said. "Go," Knox said. She pulled out her phone, and she called her son's caretaker to say she was coming home, and the word home meant the mountain house with the southern light and the birch trees and the exhibition notes on the kitchen table, and it did not mean the limestone estate or the marble island or the ring that was still sitting somewhere in a kitchen she had left at sunrise 10 months ago. It meant the life that was waiting. She had won. Now she had to go live it. The drive back to the mountain house took 2 hours and 40 minutes. She drove herself. Knox had offered the car service and she had declined because she needed the particular solitude of a road and a steering wheel and the responsibility of watching where she was going. She needed to be the person deciding the speed and the direction. She had been in rooms where other people controlled the architecture for long enough. The light was going by the time she reached the mountain roads, the sky doing the thing it did up here in late autumn, turning colors that had no name in the standard vocabulary, deep and complicated and indifferent to what they were being observed from. She drove into it with the windows up and the radio off, and she let the silence of the car hold everything that the last 2 days had been. She thought about the verdict, not the numbers, not the legal language, not what Knox had said about precedent and impact, the moment itself. The 4:02 moment when the words had been read into the record and she had sat completely still and let them be real. She had not known until that moment how much of herself she had been holding suspended, waiting. She had been so focused on the preparation, on the execution, on keeping the machine of the case moving that she had not let herself fully inhabit the possibility of winning. It was real now. She pulled into the driveway at 6:30. The porch light was on, and she could see Greta's silhouette moving behind the kitchen window. She sat in the car for a moment after she cut the engine. The birch trees were bare now, November having done its work, and their white trunks caught the porch light and held it in a way that made them look like they were lit from inside. She went in. Luca was in the high chair with sweet potato on his face, and both hands, and the tray, and possibly parts of the ceiling. He was 6 months old and had recently discovered that food was something you could interact with rather than merely consume, and he was doing so with the focused enthusiasm of a person who had made an important intellectual breakthrough. He looked up when she walked in, and his face did the thing it did. That full body recognition, every feature reorganizing toward her presence, arms reaching up with the absolute authority of someone who had no concept of requests versus demands. She picked him up, sweet potato and all, and held him against her suit jacket and felt him grab at her collar with his fist. "Hey," she said into his hair. "Hey, bud." He made a sound of satisfaction and leaned his full weight into her. Greta looked at her from across the kitchen with a question in her face that wasn't about the verdict. She had texted Greta the result from the courthouse steps. One word. One. But about the cost of it. The actual cost. The thing that didn't show up in the legal summary. "You look like you've been somewhere a long time," Greta said. "I have," Elena said. She stood in her kitchen with her son and let the mountain silence settle around her, and she breathed it in, and it was the first breath in months that did not feel like preparation. The days that followed had the quality of something new. Not easy. Nothing was easy. Luca was 6 months old, and the legal aftermath of the verdict required ongoing attention, and Knox was already managing the enforcement phase, and the federal investigation into Roman's organization had accelerated in ways that produced occasional ripples into her world, but new in a way she recognized. The newness of a life whose terms she was setting. She called David Margolis the Monday after the verdict. "I want to come back full-time," she said. "Not consulting, the show." A pause that lasted less than a second. "When?" "January. I need 6 weeks to get settled." "January?" he said. "Elena, I have been holding Ruth Kavanaugh for you for 4 months. Do you know what it's like to sit on Ruth Kavanaugh?" She almost smiled. "I'm sorry for the wait." "Don't apologize. Just come back." His voice had warmth in it that was not performed, the warmth of someone who genuinely valued what she did and had been waiting for the chance to be in a room with it again. "This show needs what you see." "I'll see you in January," she said. She spent the 6 weeks getting settled in the ways that required settlement. She hired a proper childcare arrangement for when she was working, found a pediatrician she trusted, established the mountain house as a permanent address rather than a refuge. She bought the house outright from the rental arrangement using funds from the judgment enforcement that Knox managed with the same precision he managed everything. She painted the kitchen, not because it needed painting, but because she wanted to do something to the walls that was irreversible and hers. She chose a color that was neither the pale cream of the DeLuca estate nor the white she'd lived in for a decade. She chose something that had yellow in it, warm and direct, the color of the southern light that came through those windows in the morning. Knox called in late November. "The commission met," he said. "Roman surrendered operational control of the organization 3 days ago. It was not entirely voluntary. She had expected this, had known it was coming in the weeks since the verdict, watching the way the legitimate business partners had accelerated their departures and the political relationships had quietly gone cold, and the federal investigation had moved from background to foreground in ways that left Roman standing in a space that was significantly smaller than the one he had occupied 3 months ago. "And Bianca," she said. "She left the week after the verdict was read." Knox's voice was neutral. She had transferred the Miami property into a separate holding before the civil judgment was final. "We're pursuing that through the enforcement phase. It's likely recoverable." "Keep going." "I intend to." She thought about Bianca Moretti for a moment, not with the white-hot feeling that word might once have produced, but with something flatter. A woman who had made her own calculations, and who had apparently calculated that Roman's permanent power was the stable variable and his wife was the negotiable one, and who had been wrong about which of those things would still be standing a year later. She thought about that and felt something that was not quite pity and not quite contempt, but existed in the space between them. She did not wish Bianca catastrophe. She did not wish her well. She wished her the life she had built on the choices she had made, which was complicated and hers, which was the same thing Elena wished everyone, including herself. "How is he?" she said. Knox was quiet for a moment. "He's fighting the federal case. He has resources, and he'll fight it for years. But Elena—" Another pause. "Marco Cardinale's testimony, if it comes in at trial, will be devastating." She sat with that. Marco, who had drafted the authorization email. Marco, who had been in every room. Marco, who had apparently decided at some point in the last several years that what he was part of was not worth what it was costing him, and who had walked into a federal building and told them everything. She had never spoken to Marco after that phone call in November. She had nothing to say to him that wasn't already in the public record. He had made his choices, and she had made hers, and those choices had ended up unexpectedly pointing in the same direction, and that was the whole of the relationship. "Let me know when there are developments that affect my situation," she said. "Always," Knox said. "Elena, For what it's worth, and it's been a privilege. She thought about that for a moment. For what it's worth, she said, I couldn't have done this without someone who understood what I was trying to do. You would have found a way, he said. You're the kind of person who finds a way. She let that sit with her after she hung up. She wasn't sure it was a compliment exactly. Finding a way could mean many things. It could mean resourceful. It could mean relentless. It could mean a woman who photographs 4,000 documents and monitors phone lines and prepares for 4 years and refuses every settlement and takes the witness stand and says what is true. In a room designed to test whether you'll keep saying it under pressure. Maybe all of those were the same thing. She went back to painting the kitchen. January came. She drove to New York on a Tuesday. Luca and the childcare arrangement she'd organized, the mountain house locked behind her. The Margolis Foundation's building was on the Upper West Side, a converted warehouse that had been thoughtfully done rather than expensively done. The distinction being that the renovation respected what the building had been rather than trying to replace it with something newer. She had always liked that about it. David met her at the door. He was 70 years old and had the energy of someone who had found his work at 30 and never looked back from it, compact and precise and perpetually interested in what he was looking at. He looked at her now with the expression of someone assessing what time had produced. You look different, he said. I am different. Good different or hard different? Both, she said. Probably inseparable at this point. He nodded. He understood that. He had been in the art world for 40 years and he knew that the work you did and the life you lived were not separable things, that what you saw in a painting was partly what you brought to it, and what you brought to it was everything that had happened to you. Ruth Kavanaugh, he said. Come. She followed him into the Foundation's archive space, where the Kavanaugh materials had been assembled. Prints, photographs of the originals, archival documentation, the accumulated record of a woman who had made extraordinary work in extraordinary obscurity and who had died without knowing whether any of it would last. Elena stood in front of a large print of one of Kavanaugh's late paintings. It was a landscape, technically, but the way Kavanaugh handled it made the term feel inadequate. She was not painting the landscape as it appeared, but as it felt to a person standing inside it with full attention, and the result was something that had the quality of being seen clearly rather than merely observed. She stood there for a long time. David stood beside her and didn't speak. The show needs to be structured around the late work, Elena said finally. The early pieces give context, but the late work is where she understood what she was doing. That's where the argument is. What's the argument? That she knew what she had, and she kept making it anyway, even without the market acknowledging it. That the work was not made for recognition. That it existed on its own terms. She paused. That's the argument. David looked at her. Okay, he said. Let's build it. She went back to the mountain house that evening, and she sat on the porch, and the February cold was absolute, and she had a blanket and a mug of tea, and the birch trees were bare and white in the dark. Luca was asleep inside. The baby monitor was clipped to the porch railing. She could hear the soft static of his white noise machine, and beneath it the occasional small sound of a person sleeping deeply without concern. She thought about the year, not cataloging it, not assessing it. She did enough of that in the waking hours when the operational mind was running, just sitting with the fact of it, the weight and texture of the 12 months that had brought her here. The morning she had walked through the estate in the dark with her bag and her hard drive and the ring she'd left on the marble island. The hospital room at 2 a.m. with Luca Sterling on her chest. The courtroom and the verdict and the corridor wall she had pressed her back against to breathe. She thought about Roman. She had not seen him since the verdict. He had not been in the courtroom for the reading. His attorneys had appeared without him, which was either a legal strategy or a choice he had made for his own reasons. She did not know which. She had stopped trying to decode Roman's choices from a distance, had recognized that the effort was a habit from 10 years of proximity, and that the habit was no longer useful. The supervised visitation arrangement was 6 weeks out from beginning. Knox had overseen the court's visitation order with the same precision he overseen everything. The parameters were clear and the monitoring requirements were stringent, and she had agreed to the process because it was not about Roman and what he had done. It was about Luca and what he deserved. Those were different questions, and she had learned to keep them separate. Her son deserved to know his father. Not the version of the father that lived in the public record, or the courtroom transcript, or the forensic accounting report. Whatever version existed on the other side of consequence, the man Roman was becoming inside the smaller life that was now his, Luca deserved access to that. Elena did not know whether that man was a good one. She thought it was possible. She thought consequence had a way of producing clarity that nothing else quite produced, and she thought Roman, stripped of the machine he had built around himself, might find things in himself he had not previously had occasion to locate. She was not holding the possibility open for her own sake. She was holding it for Luca. There was a difference, and she knew exactly what it was. The first supervised visit was on a Saturday in March. The location was a family center that the court used, neutral ground, a professional space with toys and low furniture and people trained to observe without intruding. She drove Luca there herself and carried him in and signed the paperwork and sat in the waiting room while the coordinator prepared the space. Roman arrived 8 minutes before the appointment time. She heard him before she saw him. The particular quality of his presence, the way a room registered him. She had spent 10 years learning to read that quality, and she could not unlearn it. She looked up from the book she was pretending to read. He was in civilian clothes. That was the first thing she noticed. Not the armor of a suit, not the careful construction of a man who moved through the world managing his impression at all times. Dark jeans, a heavy sweater, the kind of clothes that were not performing anything. He looked, she took the honest assessment, tired. Not the compressed exhaustion she had seen at the porch steps. Something that went deeper, the tiredness of months rather than weeks, of a man who had been going through something without the infrastructure that had always made going through things manageable. He saw her. They looked at each other across the waiting room. It was the first time they had been in the same space since the courtroom, and the accumulated weight of the year sat between them like weather. She did not stand up. She did not look away. Roman crossed the room. He stopped at a reasonable distance, and he looked at Luca, who was on her lap facing outward with the particular alertness of a baby encountering a new environment and finding it interesting. "He's bigger," Roman said. "6 months does that," she said. His jaw moved. He was working at something, she could see it, something he was trying to say that didn't have a form yet, or that had a form he wasn't sure he was allowed to use. "Elena," he said. "Roman. He stopped. She waited. "I know there's nothing that—" He stopped again. He was not a man who fumbled for words. He was a man who chose words with precision and delivered them at the moment of his choosing, and watching him fumble was its own kind of witness, something that had not existed in her experience of him before. "You don't have to," she said. "I want to." "I know." She looked at him steadily. "It doesn't undo what's in the record." "I know that." "So," he breathed, looked at Luca. The baby had turned slightly at the sound of Roman's voice, the way babies turn toward new sounds, and was regarding his father with the solemn, concentrated attention he brought to most things. "I didn't understand what I was doing," Roman said. "Not just the money. The whole of it. I didn't understand what I had. I understood what I had built. I thought they were the same thing." He paused. "They weren't." She held his gaze. "No," she said. "They weren't. I'm not asking for anything." He said it quickly, as if the absence of the ask was important to establish. I don't have a proposal. I'm not offering a different version of a settlement or—" "Roman." He stopped. "I know," she said. "I can tell the difference." He looked at her. Something in his face that she recognized as old, that she associated with the man before the machine had fully enclosed him, before the years and the accumulation of power had calcified around everything that was once human in him. "How do I do this?" he said. "The visits. How do I do it when everything I built that would have made me someone worth knowing has been—" "You show up," she said. "That's it. You show up, and you're present, and you're honest, and you do it again." She looked at Luca, who had put his fist in his mouth and was continuing his philosophical examination of the room. He doesn't need the empire. He never needed it. He needs a father. Roman was quiet. "I don't know if I know how to be that without the rest of it," he said. "Then you learn," she said. That's all there is. The coordinator appeared at the doorway. Mr. DeLuca, we're ready for you. Roman looked at Elena. One more moment, a question in it that wasn't about permission and wasn't about forgiveness, but was about something simpler and harder than either. She stood up. She shifted Luca in her arms and then, deliberately, she held him toward Roman. Roman took him. He took him with the careful, uncertain hands of a man who had not held this child enough times to have the physical confidence of it. And Luca looked up at him with his serious dark eyes, and Roman looked down at his son, and the room was quiet. Elena watched it. She watched it without looking away, and without the protective distance she had maintained for months, because this was the part that was not about her and Roman and what they had been. This was just a man and a child, and whatever else was true, whatever the record held, this moment was real. She let it be real. She sat back down. She picked up her book. She gave them the room. The spring came late that year, winter holding on to the mountain longer than expected. And then it came all at once, the way things do when they've been waiting, the ridge going from bare white birch to the first thin green in the course of a week, the light changing its angle, the porch becoming something you could sit on again without a blanket. The Kavanaugh exhibition opened in April. It went up in the Margolis Foundation's main gallery space, 14 paintings and 23 works on paper, with Elena's curatorial essay in the catalog and her name on the wall beside David's as co-curator. The opening was on a Thursday evening, and by 8 o'clock the gallery was full of people who stood in front of Ruth Kavanaugh's late paintings with the quality of attention that you cannot manufacture, the quality of actually seeing something. Elena moved through the room. She had worn something simple, a dark dress, her hair down, no jewelry except the small earrings she'd had since before the marriage, before the diamond rings and the estate, and the decade of performing a life inside someone else's architecture. She moved through the room and talked to people and watched their faces when they encountered the work and felt something she had not felt in years. She felt at home in herself. Not at peace. She was not a person who believed in the permanent availability of peace, and she had done enough living to know that the self was not a fixed destination, but a moving thing, always requiring maintenance, always being revised by circumstance. But at home, present inside the work and the room and the life she had built after the one she had left. David appeared beside her at the Kavanaugh painting she loved best, the largest of the late landscapes, the one that looked like clarity rather than a scene. "It's working," he said. He meant the room, the show, the way the work was landing. "It's working," she agreed. "You wrote something in the catalog," he said. "There's a line about Kavanaugh knowing what she had." He paused. "It reads like it's about something else, too." She looked at the painting, the way Kavanaugh had handled the light, not as illumination, but as an argument, as something with intention. "Probably," she said. He nodded. He was not going to pursue it. He was too experienced to pursue things people were not offering. "You should know that we've had 3 institutions reach out already. They want the show." "Take the ones that can give it what it needs," she said, "not the ones with the biggest walls." "Obviously," he said, with the tone of a man who had been doing this for 40 years and did not need the instruction, but was fond enough of her to receive it without comment. She smiled. She had not smiled without effort for a long time. This one came without effort. Later, when the opening was thinning and the caterers were beginning their quiet work of dismantling the evening, she stood alone for a few minutes in front of the Kavanaugh painting and looked at it. She thought about Ruth Kavanaugh at her studio in whatever the years were when she made this, painting a landscape that was really an argument about attention, about the discipline of looking at something until you understood what it was, painting it without a guarantee that anyone would look, painting it because the work was the point, and she understood that and kept going. Elena understood that now in a way she had not understood it before. The work was the point. The life you built was the work. You built it out of what you had, which was never what you'd planned on, and you built it without a guarantee, and you kept going because stopping was not the kind of thing you actually did once you knew what you were capable of. She had 4,312 photographs. She had a verdict. She had a son who would grow up in a house with yellow walls and southern light, and a mother who had chosen his name deliberately. She had work she believed in, and a room full of people being moved by a woman who had made beautiful things in obscurity and trusted that the things would outlast the obscurity. She was 38 years old. She had the rest of it. The visitations continued through the spring, twice monthly at first, and then, when Roman had demonstrated consistency over 3 months, the court adjusted the terms. He showed up. That was the thing she had told him, and it was the thing he had apparently decided to do. He showed up, he was present, he left the residue of the empire outside the door of the family center, and he sat on the floor with his son, and he was, in those hours, something she had not expected. He was trying. She did not mistake trying for a rival. She did not mistake it for the repair of what had been broken, because some things that are broken are simply broken, and the honest acknowledgement of that was itself a form of integrity. But she watched it happen through the coordinator's reports, and through Luca's increasing recognition of his father, the way he turned toward Roman's voice, and she let it be what it was. One afternoon in late May, she arrived to collect Luca from a visit, and Roman was in the parking lot. He'd been let out early. Luca had been fussy from a new tooth, and they had cut the session short, and the coordinator had called her, and she had come, and Roman was in the parking lot waiting for her while Luca was inside being calmed by the staff. They stood in the parking lot. The afternoon was warm, the first real warmth of the year, and the light was doing the mountain thing where it came at an angle that made everything look considered. "He's getting a tooth," Roman said. "I know. He yelled at me for 20 minutes. His mouth did something that was almost a smile. Just sustained, committed yelling. "He does that," she said. "He has opinions." "Yeah." He looked at her. He's going to be a handful. He's going to be himself," she said. "That's the whole job, letting him be himself." Roman looked at the ground. He was wearing the dark jeans again, the civilian clothes that had become his register, and he looked like a man who was occupying his life from a different angle than the one he'd built for. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said in court, about wanting the truth to exist somewhere that wasn't my version of it." He paused. "You were right. You were right to want that." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I didn't think you'd—" He stopped. "Roman." He looked at her. "You had 38 million reasons to make my version of things irrelevant," she said. "I made sure it wasn't." She said it without heat, without the weight of accusation, just the fact of it. "That's done now. What's left is him." He nodded. They stood in the parking lot in the warm May light, and the coordinator appeared at the door with Luca, who had apparently decided the tooth situation was manageable after all, and was looking around with his usual philosophical interest in the world. Roman looked at his son. "I'll see you in 2 weeks," he said. To Luca, not to her. "He'll be here," she said. She took her son and put him in the car and drove home. The mountain house in May was a different thing than the mountain house in February. The birch trees had their leaves back, that particular new leaf green that existed for about 3 weeks before it deepened, and the porch was warm in the evenings, and Luca had developed a strong interest in being held facing outward so he could examine the ridgeline with the seriousness it apparently deserved. She sat on the porch with him that evening. The light was going the way it went here, slowly and with color, and she held her son against her chest and felt the weight of him, 7 months old and already becoming himself. The particular person he was going to be already present in the way he looked at things, in the sounds he made, in the absolute certainty with which he reached for whatever he wanted. She thought about what she would tell him someday. Not yet. Someday when he was old enough for truth to be something he could use rather than something he had to carry before he had the strength for it. She would tell him about the ring on the Marble Island. She would tell him about the mountain house and the birch trees and the year she spent building a case instead of building a life, until the case was done and she could do both. She would tell him about his name and why she had chosen it, the deliberate act of naming him something that was hers, that connected him to her, that said, "This is who we are on our own terms." She would tell him that his father was a man who had made choices that cost everyone and that had also, eventually, come to understand the cost. That consequence was not the end of a person if the person was willing to be changed by it. That changed was not the same as fixed. She would tell him that the hardest thing she ever did was not the courtroom. The hardest thing was the morning after. Not the morning after the verdict, but the morning after she had left. The first morning in the mountain house when the decisions were real and permanent, and she had stood in someone else's kitchen and thought about the next 50 years. She had stood there, and she had not turned back. That was the thing she was most proud of. Not the verdict, not the photographs, not the exhibition, or the catalog, or her name on the wall beside David's. The morning in the kitchen, deciding to keep going. Deciding that the next 50 years were the point. Luca made a sound against her chest, a small, contented sound, and she pressed her lips to the top of his head. The light finished going. The birch trees went from green to gray in the dusk and then to the white that was almost luminous in the dark, and she sat with her son and listened to the mountains settle into night. She was not the woman who had stood in a gallery at 28 talking about a painting she believed in. She was not the woman who had run a mafia empire from the inside, who had attended charity galas and managed political relationships and maintained the social architecture of a life that belonged, finally, to someone else. She was the woman who had walked out before sunrise, with a hard drive and a commitment, and had not looked back. She was the woman who had named her son after herself. She was Elena Sterling, and the story was hers, and she was still in the middle of it, and the middle was exactly where she intended to stay. Present, awake, building the next thing with the same precision and care and stubbornness she had brought to surviving the last one. The night came in full. She stayed on the porch a little longer. There was no urgency. The urgency was done. What remained was the ordinary, necessary work of a life being lived forward, and she had learned, in the months of compression and crisis, to value the ordinary with a seriousness she had not possessed before. Luca was asleep. She carried him inside and put him down and stood over the crib for a moment in the dark, watching him breathe. Then she went to the kitchen and made tea and sat at the table with the exhibition notes and the yellow walls and the southern light that would come back in the morning, and she worked. She worked until she was tired enough to sleep without effort, and then she slept. And in the morning, the light came back, the way it always did, indifferent and generous and exactly what it was. She was ready for it. She